Why was this allowed to happen? Why? Because Carlos should have not been executed. He should have not been executed. They executed the wrong person.
One of the first cases we came across was Carlos DeLuna. He had said all the way along he didn't do it. A man named Carlos Hernandez did, and that was in the opinion. So that one sort of piqued my interest, although I have to say some other people said, who looked at the case, said, you know, some other guy named Carlos did it, some other dude named Carlos did it. Doesn't sound like much of a defense. It turned out that this woman, Linda Perales, was the only person in Corpus Christi that we ever identified who actually had a personal connection to both Carloses. And it was just absolute fortuity, luck, and some good instincts on our investigators' part that he went to that witness. And she gave us the name of some other relatives, and going to those relatives, it turned out that Carlos Hernandez had been telling people in his family for years, had told them that he killed Wanda Lopez and let Carlos DeLuna take the fall for him. He had a huge criminal record, just spilled all sorts of information, including a number of victims, and that included a victim who he had nearly killed in 1989, 6 years after Carlos DeLuna was convicted of this crime and just 6 months before Carlos DeLuna was executed. And she said that not only had he nearly killed her by stabbing her and cutting a 6-inch scar, 5-inch scar in her abdomen, but he had long told her that he had killed Wanda Lopez.
It's big. You want to see? That's what he did to me. I had to move out of town because he wouldn't leave me alone. Every time he would see me, he'll say that I didn't get rid of you the last time, but next time I'm going to make sure you die. And, you know, I was like, I still get, like, nightmares.
From there, we realized that this was not, you know, some silly story about some other dude named Carlos. This was a really serious thing. We identified, you know, how they had lived their lives and what their character was and what their modus operandi was, in a sense, in the crimes that they committed, and both of them had committed crimes. Carlos Hernandez's crimes were all violent crimes, always with a 8-inch, 7-inch, 8-inch lock blade buck knife, which was exactly the weapon that had been used and found at the crime scene for Wanda Lopez. Carlos DeLuna committed some crimes, a lot of petty crimes, a lot of drunkenness, and some burglaries and things like that. And then he had 2 very serious incidents that involved attempted rape. Never in his criminal record did he ever use a weapon. Carlos Hernandez always used a weapon. It was always the same weapon. Tracked down their family, their associates, their friends, their victims, and spoke to them, and began to hear a lot of information from Carlos Hernandez's associates that he had told a number of people on a number of occasions in a number of ways, with quite a bit of detail about the fact that he killed Wanda Lopez, and laughed about the fact that he had let Carlos DeLuna, his tocayo, which means his namesake or twin, take the fall for him. A major part of our investigation turned out to be a man named Eddie Garza. And Eddie Garza had been a detective in Corpus Christi for 20 years. He had some doubts about the case because he had heard on the streets within weeks of the crime that Carlos Hernandez was going around saying he had committed the crime, and he passed that information on to another detective. And he also reviewed the entire file for us as sort of an expert, local expert on things, and told us about how badly the investigation had gone, how poorly it had been conducted. And he said that this was just a rush to judgment.
Carlos Hernandez was mostly always assaulting women, assaulting guys, and his weapon of choice was a knife. He always had a knife on him, and most of the time it was cutting up people. There will be a doubt in my mind because after going through all the evidence that was presented, I don't see how anybody could get a conviction with the evidence that was available to convict Carlos DeLuna.
Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Everything was just not as good as it could have been, and in some ways not very good, but not, as I say, the worst of anything. So the investigation was very, very poor, and it ended very soon, and it could have continued. The defense lawyers, when they knew all along, Carlos DeLuna told them all the way along that he didn't do it, somebody else did. But for the first several months, he said, I'm too scared of this guy to tell you who it is. You need to go out and find him. And we know that everybody was scared of Carlos Hernandez, and he actually avoided being convicted of another murder by beating up the eyewitness and threatening him that if he ever spoke, he would kill him and his family. And we spoke to this man years later, and he would not talk to us to that day, 25 years later, until we showed him Carlos Hernandez's death certificate. DeLuna didn't come up with the name until right before trial. When he did come up with the name, the defense lawyers turned the name over to the prosecutors and police, but they didn't conduct their own investigation at that point. They thought, well, we've given the name to the police and the prosecutors, let's let them do it. Then it turned out that through the period between 1983, when the conviction occurred, and 1989, when Carlos DeLuna was executed, in between then, Carlos Hernandez had been arrested on a number of occasions. In fact, Carlos DeLuna's execution appears to have been itself botched in this case. And Reverend Pickett was there at the time of the execution, is convinced in his mind that the way things went and the time it took and the fact that Carlos DeLuna picked up his head like 12 seconds into the process when he should have been absolutely paralyzed, that something had gone wrong with the execution as well. So from start to finish, things went badly.
He just wanted to know if he could call me daddy, if it would hurt my feelings, because he had never had anybody that stick by him who was in a fatherly position. And I felt like if he could call me daddy, that would be fine. It sort of shook me up real bad. Daddy is a little bit beyond just father. But he was willing to discuss anything after he got permission to call me daddy. And he said, will you be with me, daddy? He said, I'll be right with you. Will you hold my hand? And I told him before I got in there, I said, there are only certain times I can hold your hand. I fully believe Carlos DeLuna was an innocent man. And I will always believe that.
A lot of what people tend to talk about in capital cases is they take too long, let's move them faster, we don't need to worry about these claims of innocence. And what I would take from this case is we need to be really careful, and we need to use the procedures that we know how to use, do things better, do things carefully, and that takes time and that takes money. Number one, I'm convinced that no jury could possibly have convicted Carlos DeLuna beyond a reasonable doubt on the evidence here. That's absolutely clear. It's also something that Eddie Garza said. Secondly, I'm absolutely clear that the evidence does show that Carlos Hernandez committed this crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Am I absolutely certain? I leave that up to the readers. There's nothing that happened in this case that is unusual and that doesn't continue to happen today. It's a shame that it took a massive investigation years later to find this, but unless we do that kind of investigation, including in cases like this that nobody paid attention to, nobody ever thought this was an innocence case, we really can't be sure. Both of them are devastated by what happened. Both of them lost a sibling who they were actually quite close to and who in each in their own way, was a great support and a person of great importance to both of them.
And the time of the funeral, when I saw Carlos in that casket, it was the saddest day of my life. Having to watch him be buried. Every time I go to Corpus, if we have to go there for whatever reason, it just brings all that past memories. And all I want to remember, Carlos, is that moment that he hugged me. And he said he loved me.